We're here with Victoria Moran from Main Street Vegan.
You are so fat and so beautiful.
Paul McCartney bought you a drink at 17,
is
that right?
He did, yes. And I drank it.
Nature's Viagra.
Okay, well, I'm taking all that home.
Being vegan. Eat plants, save animals, and have a dazzling life. I love that.
I have 700 graduates around the world, vegan businesses, vegan influencers, doing so much more than I could do in 10 lifetimes.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Viva Vegan podcast. My guest this month is vegan legend Victoria Moran.
Thank you.
Now, Victoria has been an ethical vegan for longer than my entire lifespan. Sorry. What a start. Apologies, Victoria. She is the author of 13 books on both veganism and spirituality, 3 of which are bestsellers, and one of her books, Main Street Vegan, was actually co-written with her daughter, and it has received praise from the likes of Moby, Ellen DeGeneres, Michael Moore, and a plethora of other big names. She has appeared not once, but twice on Oprah, and back in 2016, she was voted PETA's Sexiest Vegan over 50. How was that, Victoria?
It was weird because even, at 25, I might have described myself as, pleasant, never sexy. Sexy was just, sexy was always, women who could wear really high heels and, maybe they had boob jobs or something. So that was never how I identified myself. But I really think that PETA contest was more of a Lifetime Achievement Award because people voted. And I do have to say that one of the most gratifying experiences of my life was reading what people said when they voted, because people had the option if they wanted to write a little something. And people that I had known years ago back in the Midwest of the US, where I come from, where veganism was never very popular, people who would never intentionally go to a PETA website for any purpose, they went there to vote for me because they said that I had influenced them and that now they were drinking almond milk instead of cow's milk or whatever it was. So it was really cool in that way. The sexy part is still like, oh my God, I hope I'm not harming vegans because they think that I'm the best one they could find.
No, don't think like that. But it is lovely that you describe that as a lifetime achievement because it almost brings your career full circle. I mean, you started out incredibly young with writing. I mean, you were a music journalist as a teenager. And in fact, Paul McCartney bought you a drink at 17. Is that right?
He did, yes. And I drank it. I started out writing at around, I always wrote even as a little kid. But at 14, when the Beatles came to the U.S., I got a teen stringer press card for a teen magazine. You could get one for $1. And lots of little girls had them, but I took it very, very seriously. So I got into my first Beatles press conference at 14, second Beatles press conference at 15, and I was supposed to go to the one in Chicago when I was 16, but that was the year that John Lennon said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And fearing reprisals from churches, which actually did come, they canceled the afternoon Chicago press conference for which I had my invitation. So I'm 16, I'm alone in Chicago with no place to go. So I called my dad, and it was so interesting because my dad didn't know what to think of my kind of teen rock group journalism. But that day, he was okay with it, and he managed to get a ticket and get up to Chicago. We checked into the Beatles hotel, and I started to get into the elevator because I saw Mal Evans, who was one of the Beatles managers. I knew all this because I was a fan. And he said, "What floor are you going to?" And I said, "Well, I'm on 11, but I'd like to go to 22. He said, "I'm on 22. And I'm thinking, you think I don't know that? Anyway, long and short of it, Mal Evans, rest his soul, came to dinner with my dad and me. And we became friends, and we kind of became pen pals. And then when I was in London the following spring, one night, Mal and my dad and I were going to a club called Bag of Nails, which was there at that time, and then it went away. And now my understanding is it's back in some other kind of iteration. And he said, "There's someone I want you to meet." And so we walk through this big, smoky, cavernous kind of place, and way in the back, there is Paul McCartney, who happened to be my favorite Beatle. And we are introduced, and Paul goes, "Hello, Vicky." It's like, this is the pinnacle of achievement. And then he says, to the server, "Scotch and Coke, 3 doubles." Okay, I'm 17. I've never drunk anything in my life. And he said double. And I'm thinking, I'll probably die, but I'll die with a Beatle. So I have done everything that I need to do. Except I hadn't really done everything that I needed to do. And it's so interesting looking back on that was the month before Paul met Linda at that very same place. They met at Bag of Nails, and the rest is history. And of course he became very vegetarian and animal rights, and I did, and here we are.
What an incredible story. But I suppose it shows your tenacity, knowing the name of the managers and the producer or whoever it may be. And I mean, I think that's a really telling sign of where your path's going to go.
Well, I believe in reincarnation, and I don't know that it's true. I don't know that anybody knows what's true about the great big picture questions, but I was raised with it. I had a really interesting nanny. She was quite eclectic. She was a grandmother-age woman who had looked into lots of the mysteries of life. And so it just, as a working hypothesis for me, it's always made so much sense that we show up here. There was a beautiful poem by Wordsworth where he said, "We arrive not in pure forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory from God who is our home." And I think we all show up here with our clouds of glory from different experiences and different times. And for me, I'm very, very attached to London. I could give people directions there when I was 11. And even though I've been there, I think it's 28 times, I can't give them directions now. I've forgotten. But back then, I could. And I think there was history there. And I think that, a lot of this stuff would kind of make sense if we could fill in all the dots.
Now, you grew up in Missouri, but in 1968, you actually moved to London. So what was that like for you? Did you relish in that,
Yes.
being part of the swinging 60s, or was it a bit of a culture shock?
No, it was magnificent because I'd been there before. That year that I met Paul McCartney, that was 67. So it was all very close. And there were so many magical things going on.
And was this around the time as well that you became vegetarian?
Yes. I had tried to be vegetarian at 13 because I'd always loved animals. And once I made that connection, I really wanted to do it. I lasted 4 months, and I didn't know what to eat. I was eating cottage cheese and fruit cocktail. But ultimately, when I was in London, I got into Weight Watchers, and it was working for me in terms of losing weight. And at that time, everybody in Weight Watchers was on the same diet. They called it a food plan. And you were supposed to eat beef 3 times a week, and you had to eat fish 5 times a week. And there was this mythology that if you stopped eating fish, you would just gain so much weight, you could just, you would never be able to get through a door again. So I gave up the beef. And this is so interesting because as vegans, when people say things like, "Well, I don't eat red meat," we're like, "Oh, yeah. Who cares what color it is? All the animals value their lives the same." But, I was back there doing that, so I can't really judge. So I just couldn't give up the fish. So I was pescatarian while I was in London. Then I got back to the States, and I did get rid of the fish, but because I believed that if I didn't eat fish 5 times a week, I would gain all kinds of weight. I did. And I very close to doubled my weight when I was back in America. And I'd been living in my hometown, Kansas City, and I just couldn't face myself. So I moved to a suburb of Chicago and lived at the Theosophical Society and worked in their library. And they were vegetarian. And so I thought, I'll be here. I'll eat 3 vegetarian meals a day. I'll lose weight. I'll go back to Kansas City in all my glory. But I didn't. And so that was just a real struggle in my youth. And I think we all kind of come with gifts and challenges. And we're just met with both of them and get to deal with them. That was just my story. Those are my details. Our details are different. Our stories are the same.
That's actually really interesting. And did you notice a difference in the foods that they were eating in America versus the UK?
It was very much the same, bread, cheese, meat, sweets, just not much emphasis on fresh foods. And I think for me, of course, it was more than food choices. It was trying to fill this inner hole with something. And I picked food. But what ultimately happened when I went vegan, because I struggled with all this, overeating thing for many years, when I went vegan finally at the age of 33, and I'd been active in that animal rights movement for all those years in between. I was vegetarian and very active in animal, demonstrations and protests and writing articles and going to conferences. And I would be periodically vegan, for times. But then I would end up on an eating binge and I'd go back to the cheese and the ice cream and whatnot. And when I finally made it to vegan, it was kind of a double thing for me. First was that I had found Overeaters Anonymous, and that 12-step program really did it for me because I really needed the healing on the inside out. And I'd always had it in the back of my head that if I were vegan, my weight problem would probably never go away because of all those carbs. But of course, what actually happened was when I finally went vegan and was doing the 12-step program so that I was no longer binging or eating for a fix, the weight just fell off so gently. It wasn't like a diet. It wasn't like, oh my God, I lost 4 pounds this week. It was just this sort of sweet, gentle thing that got me to a realistic kind of body size, not that kind of skinny, twiggy thing that I always thought I was supposed to be. And it just never changed. I remember, it would be years, and summer would come and I'd get out the summer clothes and they would fit. And winter would come and I'd get out the winter clothes and they would fit. And it was just this beautiful combination for me, heal from the inside out and be vegan. Because then you're the way you eat, it's almost like a Holy Communion, because you're making choices that are so that you're not harming somebody else. It's a beautiful way to live. And I did write a book about all this, the Love-Powered Diet, that is still available. It's also on Audible. I don't read it, but a nice voice reads it. And it kind of tells my story. And then, the way out of, or one way out of compulsive eating and a vegan lifestyle.
That's very true. And it's the work from within that counts as well as the external factors that are affecting you. And about how you overcome these challenges and learn to live with them, with the kind of acceptance and grace that comes from acknowledging this and forgiving yourself. And I guess it's interesting that we're discussing these themes because you actually majored in religious studies, didn't you? I mean, has theology always been something that's interested you? Were you brought up with religion?
I was supposed to be Catholic because my dad was Catholic. Not practicing maybe consistently, but I was still supposed to be that. My mother had nominally converted. There is a big story in my family that she took the Catholic lessons and after the last one said to the priest, "Thank you, Father, I learned a lot, but I'll be damned if I don't use birth control." So that was, kind of the way Catholicism came in. But because both my parents worked, and this was back in the days when certainly in the U.S. it was very unusual to have a two-parent working family. And so they didn't have daycare centers or anything like that. So they found this nanny for me. I went through several. And then when I was 6 months old, this woman came that I mentioned before who was into all these kinds of spiritual teachings. She actually was the first person to tell me that there were vegetarians in the world. And so I had her kind of, I don't know if you want to call it New Age or ancient wisdom or, whatever. So sure, there was that influence. And then there was the Catholicism, which was grand and beautiful, and the incense and the stained glass, and that was so lovely. But the theology never spoke to me. I was always really listening. And I couldn't get very far into the creed before I started arguing. And then my mother had been in all kinds of Protestant religions growing up. And my dad's office, his medical practice in Kansas City, was in a very mixed neighborhood. It had been kind of Eastern European Jewish, and then by the time I came along, it was mostly African American. And so his clientele, his patients, were from all these interesting kind of ethnic variations. So we were going to weddings and funerals and bar mitzvahs in all kinds of religions and all different ways of seeing life. So to me, the idea that you're supposed to pick one and that one is right, and you're only cool with God if you pick the right one, I just couldn't go there. So ultimately it was yoga and a kind of Eastern teachings. So my culture, very much Christian. When an inspirational quotation comes to me, chances are it's attributed to Jesus. And yet my worldview is very, very yogic, with the reincarnation and the fact, I call it the fact, to me it's a fact, that within us, at our heart center, is this light, this divine, and that everybody has that, everybody of all species has that, plants have it in their own way. And I guess even rocks. I mean, I think if we could really see for a minute, the whole universe is this incredible, alive, vibrant manifestation of something beyond comprehension. And all I can do with it as a regular person is live ahimsa, nonviolence, to the best of my ability, and get quiet fairly regularly to remember that I'm not the to-do list, and I'm not everything that I accomplish and everything that I screw up. There's something beyond all that. So that's how I see it.
That's really interesting, particularly with regards to how you've been exposed to different religious ideologies. I want to pick up on what you said, and that's, if you trace these ideas back historically, there's a long tradition of veganism and philosophy. You can look at people like the Cathars, who abstained from eating animals and their byproducts, again tying into the idea of reincarnation. And people today are actually really championing those viewpoints. People like Earthling Ed, who explains the principle of taking into yourself the soul of a tortured animal. You, however, have spoken in even more depth about tracing this lineage back all the way to Pythagoras. And Pythagoras believed that we would become animals upon dying, or that we had the potential to be. So there's a whole history, isn't there, of tying the soul's journey into not exploiting animals or people. I mean, as you even touched on, even rocks and grass, where more and more studies are finding the kind of interconnectedness of everything. And yeah, I realize I sound like a hippie now, but what I'm trying to say is that there's a long tradition of these ideas and philosophies being discussed.
Well, and I think that's very exciting, and I think it's something that all of us as vegans need to know about to a degree. Some people are history buffs. They want to know the history of everything. But just for all of us as vegans, we need to know that this didn't just start in 1980 with PETA, this has been, or 1945 with the Vegan Society. This has been part of human history as long as we've had human history. But what's interesting is it seems to be that in every era, there's only been a certain small percentage of people who get it. So just the other day, I heard from one of my Main Street Vegan Academy graduates who's in Finland, and she sent me some beautiful quotations from a highly regarded clergyman there, I believe it's in the Church of Finland, who was talking about how animals have to count. And he was coming from the Christian idea that humans have dominion, but that what that means is that we have to care for the other beings and for the earth, and that to deny that is simply to deny the Christian life. And it was so interesting to me because there's one more. Here's this person in Finland. Maybe he's the only clergyman in Finland who has written about this so far. I don't know for sure. But it's been like that forever. So if you look at early Christianity, it's so fascinating. So many of those early Christians, the people who became Christian right around, the time of Jesus's death and for the next 200 years, they were just vegetarian all over the place, and probably what we would today call vegan, because the idea that in that time in history people would raise animals only for milk or for eggs, it just wouldn't have made much sense. And then, of course, we have Jains who have gone further probably than any established religion in being vegetarian, and many young Jains, of course, now are giving up the dairy as well. And there's always been the vegetarian lineage in Hinduism and in certainly some parts of Buddhism. So it's in there. It's just that it's so easy to also find ways, if you're just going by religious teachings, if you don't want to be vegan, to say, well, Buddha said if you were a monk, you could eat whatever somebody gave to you, or it's okay to have meat if it wasn't killed for you. But, come on, it's all killed for us. It's killed for whoever's going to pay the money for it. So I love it that if somebody's on a spiritual path, there's every kind of support for being vegan on whatever path you're on. And yet you can also come to it in a very secular way, and you're still doing God's work.
I like that you countered that by saying that there are people throughout history that do get it. But of course, as we know, there are people who will change things to kind of suit their own agendas. Just look at Plato, straight from the Aristotle school of thought. He completely changed the ideology of animals having souls. And he said, no, only humans have souls. Therefore, the universe is for humans only. And that's probably one of the earliest examples of twisting this viewpoint to suit his own agenda to the exclusion of animals.
And there have been so many like that, the whole idea of animals as automatons, which now, just based on science, we know is completely ridiculous. And I guess it's just human nature to think that we are so special. And throughout history, I think we've always believed, well, my group, my tribe, people who look like me, people who think like me. But now we're being called upon. That's just breaking apart. We're past that, or we need to be past that, which is really exciting. And I think we're all very lucky to be alive at the time when this is happening.
Very true. And it's not just food production and how we need to be mindful about what we're consuming. It actually feels like a lot of the old systems are failing in their current form, or at least are changing, or dare I say it, in some cases even evolving. So yeah, I agree. It's a very, very interesting time to be alive right now. But I would like to go back to the Main Street Vegan, which you touched upon. You kind of mentioned that the book came about after what sounds very much like a download of information or an epiphany moment for you. And that was where you had the idea to write the book. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, I'd love to. So it was December of 2010. And I went to a PETA event here in New York City, and they showed video of, the terrible things humans do to animals. I'd been seeing videos like that for 30 years by then. I mean, it wasn't anything new. But for some reason, that night, my heart was especially open. And all I wanted to do was just write PETA a check for $100,000, but it would have bounced. So I was in the subway and kind of talking to God, like, why can't I give PETA $100,000? What's wrong with me? And kind of this sort of message, I don't know how else to say it, kind of came back and said, okay, so you don't have that, but here's what you do have. You can write a book, and you can call it Main Street Vegan, because it's going to be geared to that young woman that you were when you were living in that suburb of Chicago and ultimately became vegan. And it needs to have 40 little chapters because people don't have long attention spans. And you need to put a recipe at the end of each chapter, and it has to be really easy because people like, and I'm just like, okay. And I mean, some people would say, that, you're just thinking, and maybe I was, I don't know, but it felt like it was literally, like you said, being downloaded, like I was getting this inspiration. So the next day I called my agent and said, we need to scrap this book that I've been working on, and we need to do this other one, and it's called Main Street Vegan, blah, blah, blah. So I did the proposal. We got a wonderful publisher. And the first day I talked to the editor there, she said, oh, we're so excited that you're going to be writing this book for us, but we hate Main Street. So for English listeners and other listeners that don't know what Main Street means in the US, you can kind of equate it to like High Street in towns in England. But over here, Main Street is an identity and a feeling. And sometimes you'll hear the phrase Main Street versus Wall Street. So Wall Street, where the stock exchange is, this is people with lots of money and whatnot. And Main Street is the regular people, and the people just keeping the family values, and they're just keeping everything going. And so I knew that this was the audience that I wanted to reach, because so often people who are interested in even looking into veganism, that's not who they are. There's some kind of, intellectual, academic types or lots of people in entertainment and whatnot. But there aren't very many of those kind of people. And I want to get a lot of vegans. So I knew it had to be called Main Street Vegan. But they had bought the book. And so I had to write it and figure out another name for it. So I'm doing that. Couldn't come up with a better name. So I'm walking up Broadway, and I see somebody so famous you can recognize him from the back, and that's Michael Moore, the filmmaker. And he had liked a book that I wrote earlier, a weight loss book. It had helped him lose some weight. And so I just gave my card to the woman who was with him. I didn't know if she was his manager or what. Turned out she was his sister. And went on up the street, and then I hear, Victoria! And here's Michael Moore following me up Broadway. And after exchanging pleasantries, he said, we need to talk. We need to talk about food. So we start having these conversations at nighttime usually. He's kind of a night person. And at one point, I just say, yeah, this book I'm writing, it's supposed to be called Main Street Vegan. The publisher hates that. He said, she's wrong. Let me talk to her. So this Academy Award winner and my editor and I have this call. He convinces her, and she convinces her team. And as soon as I know that that's my book, that I've got that title, all these other ideas start popping. There should be a Main Street Vegan podcast. There should be a Main Street Vegan Academy, training and certifying vegan lifestyle coaches and educators. There should be Main Street Vegan Productions, so you could do movies. And at the time, it's like, wait a minute, the book isn't even out yet, and you don't know if anybody will buy it. But somehow it was just the continuation of that, what happened in the subway. And I look at my Main Street Vegan Academy graduates. We've got about 700 from 33 countries on 6 continents. And this was never anything that I ever thought I'd do. And what is cool for me at my current age, which is 73, is I don't have grandchildren, and I won't have any. My daughter has told me she's not having kids. But I have 700 graduates around the world in vegan businesses, vegan coaching, vegan influencers, doing so much more than I could do in 10 lifetimes, because there's 700 of them and more, as every course happens. So it is pretty special.
But you've also veganized yoga as well as you've gotten older. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yoga was vegetarian. You were expected to not eat meat and ideally not eat eggs. I kind of avoided that part, but that would, lacto-vegetarian was the tradition for yoga. And now after these many years, and I've continued with the practice. In fact, I want my next book, please God, that I get a publisher, to be called Age Like a Yogi, because I'm using those principles so much to help navigate the exigencies of later life. But it's about time for yoga to veganize. And a lot of people would say, hey, wait a minute, you white woman. You don't have any right to say what yoga should do because it's not from your culture. It came from India, and I honor that it came from India, but I have incorporated it into my life so that it's part of me. So as a yoga practitioner, and I'm around a lot of other yoga practitioners, we kind of have two jobs before us. One is to remind the yoga community that it does have vegetarian roots, because a lot of modern Western practitioners are eating meat, which is just like, how can you do that? I remember one yoga teacher was telling me, isn't it wonderful we don't have to be vegetarian anymore now that there's humane meat? And it's just like, you never had to be vegetarian. That was just if you wanted to do this right, if you wanted to reap benefits, if you wanted to be honest and have integrity. So that's the first thing. And then there is the, historically, yoga was not vegan, but things change.
I absolutely love that. And again, that's the spiritual side of things combined with the physical side of yoga. But something you also touched upon very briefly was the idea of epigenetics, which for our listeners, I will use this moment to explain that I am not a scientist. But epigenetics is how environmental or behavioral factors can kind of affect the way that your genes work. And my understanding is that while it can't change a DNA sequence, what it can do is change the way a DNA sequence is read. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. I'm not a scientist, and so I don't want to say anything that would be inaccurate, but I believe that the understanding now is that the way we live can actually influence what we pass along to future generations.
Which ties in completely with the nature of embracing lifestyle changes and choices that we then pass down. Obviously, there's still a lot of studies to be done on this, but at its simplest, it does explain why you've got ideas such as generational trauma that go on to exist in second generations, or why women will eat healthier diets when they're conceiving and being pregnant, to give that unborn child the best possible start. So yeah, I think it's really worth thinking about, and it'll be very interesting to see what kind of studies come out further along the line.
It's just this wonderful way to kind of give yourself a head start. So, we always think about veganism from the ethical point of view, from we are doing this for the animals, which of course we are. And yet, maybe it's kind of karma. What happens for people who are vegan, there is a lot of payback, even though that's not why we're doing it. So, we get better health. And I understand there's all kinds of vegan processed food out there now, and we have to have a little bit more discretion in what we choose and how often than we did back in the day when we had to eat vegetables and fruits and whole grains and nuts and seeds and beans, because that was all there was. But still, you're going to have this degree of health. And if you get into the whole food, plant-based thing or raw food or one of those kinds of deals, you're going to have really measurably better health, which is going to give you more time with all of your faculties intact to do your work in the world. Then you're also going to have this tremendous release of guilt that you probably didn't even know you had. Because whenever we're out there eating meat and taking on all that karma of killing animals, of paying other people to kill animals, that's just a tremendous burden at a soul level, even if you're not thinking anything about it. And then you stop doing that, and that burden is released. So you get all this energy. And very often we say, oh, wow, once I became vegan, I got so much energy, it must be the food. Well, that's part of it. But the other part of it is that you're not carrying that weight of being part of harm and destruction. And now all of a sudden you're on the side of uplift and making the world better and making the world kinder and saving lives. It's all so cool. And then the final thing is you're on the right side of history. So it's like a wave. And all these vegans and vegetarians that we talked about from antiquity and on through history, and even the wonderful folks who started the Vegan Society back in the 1940s, that wave was just a trickle. It was just beginning. And they had so much to put up with because nobody was vegan. And they had to prove to the world that they weren't all going to die. And some of them did, because we didn't know about vitamin B12, so, which is so important to be sure that we get that. But where we are now is this is a wave. And why on earth would anybody want to be going against that wave? Because when you're with it, your life gets easier. You have more serendipities. You have more running into the people you need to run into, the manifestation of the means to take yourself further. So it's just so the right place to be.
I think that's the perfect natural conclusion to our conversation today. And of course, the takeaway thought is veganism is great. And why would you not want to do this? So again, thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. However, just before you go, I really should ask, because we all like a bit of gossip.
Yeah.
You've appeared on Oprah twice.
I did.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about the woman, the myth, the legend, how that came about? Because, we all love a bit of celeb gossip.
Oh, absolutely. The show that I was on was about inner beauty. They had taken makeup away from these 3 women for 3 weeks who were used to wearing makeup. And so she asked me a question, and I responded with an anecdote about a friend of mine who had been to India. And she was what would have been considered, certainly, 20 years ago, in this culture as very overweight, but women in India would say to her, "Oh, you're so fat and so beautiful. I try to be fat and I just can't do it. What's your secret?" And then Oprah just pause, and then she comes up and says, "Can't wait to go to India." And she gets this huge laugh. And it was just like, I set Oprah up for a laugh. It was kind of like that Paul McCartney feeling, like, okay, I've done it now. If I die today, I will have been here long enough. So, it was a great experience. She's an amazing, fascinating woman. I hope one of these days we will get her vehemently vegan, and Michael Moore and some of these other people. But for now, there's us and your listeners. So we'll go with that.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you.